All right. Good evening, everybody. I suppose we can start. Anyways, just a few seconds before 18 hours, but we might as well start. I think I'm going to kindly ask if you can maybe signal um, through a thumbs up or something. If you can hear me just fine. Beautiful. Thank you very much, Mr. Mwansasa. All right. Yeah. So we're going to start here. I had initially planned for us to have two makeup sessions this weekend, so yesterday and today. But unfortunately, I've had a very, very hectic weekend, and in fact, it's one of the reasons why I essentially reached out only some 2 hours ago or something to confirm that we'd have class or something. I do apologize for sending out confirmation rather late. But that being said, we're going to continue. More importantly, though, I do hope that most of you have already started thinking about what sort of areas you'd want to focus on when you transition to part two. The reason why this is important is because this is June, right? Well, this is July actually. And one of the key outputs for 5019, if you're doing this course for credit, aka if you're in your first year of study and you're pursuing a coursework and dissertation master's program, the expectation is that one of the key deliverables is going to be a detailed proposal document. And traditionally, what we've done is to cut down on the amount of time that you'd potentially spend, working on your proposal document. We try to encourage you to essentially use the proposal that you're going to develop as part of 5019 as a working proposal, if I can equate that, or a working title of what you eventually work on in part two. It doesn't necessarily mean that what you're going to propose to do in the proposal document produced as part of 5019 is what you ultimately do in part two, because it turns out that at some point you're going to be assigned a supervisor, and your supervisor is the one who's going to help you develop the proposal document ideally. Many a times we have instances where the things that you propose, and as much as they can, be used as part of the academic exercises we're doing in 5019, but they may not necessarily be sufficient for you to work on as a quote-unquote topic for a dissertation for when you transition to part two. So I hope you've already started thinking about this, right? The potential problems. If you're fortunate, or maybe unfortunate, I don't know, when you're paired with a supervisor in part two, there are some supervisors that may have problems already available. So they may have, or they may be currently working in commissioned research, or problems that have open problems. So in such instances, your supervisor may actually suggest that you work on a predefined problem set or something, or a predefined problem or topic. But with that being said, today we're going to transition to our discussion of module number 3, or lecture series number 3, which is tagged as defining research problems, objectives, and questions. It's a fairly short lecture series. You'll notice from the lecture slide decks that I think there's like less than 60 slide decks or something. So it's a fairly short lecture series because the key things to pay particular attention to really would be the characteristics of a so-called problem statement, objectives, and questions that you want to take into account when you're working on your research problem. Okay. So this is going to be this is a bit strange here. Just a minute. I think this is going to be there's a bit of an issue here with with this, because I was reusing the, what do you call this, slide deck from lecture series number 2. So this actually is going to be the lecture outline, right? We'll look at briefly, just touch on how exactly we go about identifying research problems, and then we'll then look at, in essence, our focus is going to be on 3 key things. Okay, how do we write? The idea here is how do we write or phrase a problem statement? Okay, so we want to look at exactly what sort of characteristics are associated with the statement, and then also how do we phrase, research objectives and research questions. That's what we want to focus on. All the while, what you will notice here, the thing to appreciate is the fact that the problem statement, and I guess to a certain extent, the research objectives and the research questions form what's typically called the golden thread in research, because it turns out that everything that you do after is ideally supposed to make reference to the golden thread. So in other words, what we are saying is that when we once we frame our problem, right? We are framing our problem at the very beginning here, right? And if we look at it from the perspective of the structure of research, right? What we're saying is that we frame the problem in the introduction or something, irrespective of whether this is the final report. So a journal article, the dissertation, the thesis, manuscript, conference proceeding paper, a dataset paper, a dataset description paper, more aptly put. It really doesn't matter. The structure is more or less the same. You have an introduction. You would obviously have your related work or something. You then have your methodology, right? If you look at the final report, you'd have your results. You would have your discussion. You'd have your conclusion or something. In some instances, especially in technical papers, engineering and especially computer science, we usually would have some people would have a dedicated kind of section here, design and implementation or something, right? If you're building an artifact. Now, I've always thought that the design and implementation is best integrated as part of the methodology itself, because what you're outlining in the design and implementation is really a methodological approach. I bet the methodological approach associated with the design and implementation of the artifact is systematic in a sense, right? So you are outlining the software process model that you're going to utilize, whether it's waterfall model, agile-centric or incremental and iterative approaches like rapid rational unified process, RAD, rapid application development, or agile-centric approaches like Scrum or feature-driven development. So you essentially explain all those gory details of how the artifact was built, or in the case of the proposal, how the artifact is going to be built as part of the design process, is it? So things like the UML diagrams that you feel are important to include in the proposal or in the final report, architectural design artifacts, okay? So high-level architectural diagrams, if you will. In some instances, they may be really detailed. Yeah, so, and the tools, right? And technologies that you used when you're developing the software. So what programming languages, what frameworks were used, and all of those things. You'd essentially include all of those in the methodology. And perhaps what is interesting here and intriguing is that generally, the activities that are associated with design and implementation would somewhat appear in the golden thread itself, things we're discussing in this lecture series. So you typically have an objective that is going to force you to develop the piece of software, right? Design and implement the piece of software. Typically, common phrasing would be things like, what is the feasibility here? What is the feasibility of designing and implementing an intelligent system that will be able to predict who is going to win the 2026 presidential elections, or some weird, specific objective like that. Now, if you really look at an objective like that, you begin to notice that it's forcing you to build software, right? And so this is where Golden Thread starts from. And the way that you work on an objective like this is you outline exactly how you're going to build the software. Anyhow, something else worth mentioning is that, and I think it's important that we address this issue early on in the process before the damage is done. Many a times we have a number of our students that it's hard for you to move away from the fact that there's a difference between engineering and research. Okay, so if you're pursuing a computer science centric program in the School of Natural and Applied Sciences, the focus or emphasis is on the science, on the research part. Building the artifact is a means to an end. The goal really is not really to build, it's really to build software. So we always have instances where, if you look at a typical dissertation coming from the department, during examination, you have people that will literally include all the details to do with, the requirement specification and elicitation process. I've certainly read dissertations where students will actually include virtually all the different categories of the unified modeling language, right? UML. If you look at the UML specification, you begin to notice that there are clusters, right, of diagrams that you can actually use, right, to represent the different views of whatever system you're building. You have like your static views, your behavioral views, your interaction views, and all those things. If you remember your software engineering, your introduction to software engineering. But it turns out that that's not the focus. That's not what we expect to be the focus for a master's, right? Yes, we do expect you to outline exactly how the software was built, but that should not really be the focus. Okay, so it's, in essence, we are going to focus on the golden thread in this lecture series. Now, a quick reminder here that we, in our inaugural lecture class, I think it was, maybe not, maybe it was different sort of interaction. We introduced what we referred to as a 7-step research process. Okay, so in essence, the various or the distinct stages that you undertake or you execute when you are carrying out a research project. Okay, in as much as there are 7, we can pretty much map all of these different steps onto the classical phases of the so-called scientific method, so the diagram on the right. So we went through all of the 7 here, and we realized that the very first thing that we do is we've got to define the problem, right? And then we do some kind of like MAUD. I won't really call this MAUD really, but we conduct a literature synthesis or a literature review, after which we formulate the objectives, right? Or the research questions or hypotheses, if applicable. Now, you begin to notice here that you probably be sitting there and you're asking yourself, well, we're not really, it's like we're not really going through these stages in the order that they appear. Yes, that is true. The reason here is that it becomes a lot easier for you to understand exactly how to identify appropriate literature if you already have a sense of what sort of problem you're going to be working towards. That's the one thing. One way of looking at why we've skipped this phase here, literature review here, and just jumped onto formulation of problem statement, then formulation of objectives and research questions, right? Another way of looking at this really is that the expectation really is that if you look at it from the perspective of what you're going to be doing, in part 2, or for the doctoral students, I guess what you've already started doing, you've actually started doing your literature review, right? In fact, the appropriate phrase is you started conducting your literature synthesis, right? So it's really, and you started canvassing, it's the landscape associated with this problem that you're interested in, even way before you actually develop your proposal, right? So in other words, what we're saying is, once you come up with it, conceptualize an idea, the next logical step to do is you do a very mild literature review, right? You look at what other people have done. Especially important when you are pursuing your doctoral studies, because one of the things that are expected of you is for you to, quote unquote, demonstrate or clearly state what the novelty of the research project you're undertaking is, what is new, right? And it turns out that what is new must be identified early on before you invest time in coming up with a research proposal, meaning that you'd still need to do like a preliminary research synthesis, if you will, right? And then after you do a preliminary research synthesis, you then carefully frame your problem, if you will, right? So you come up with a problem statement, you identify or you carve out from the problem statement the main objective, and then from the main objective you flesh out the specific objectives, and then using specific objectives you then come up with your research questions. It turns out that once you do that, again, looking at it from the perspective of what you're going to be doing in part 2, once you frame your problem, right, you use that as input to actually come up with a detailed proposal document. Now, when you're coming up with a detailed proposal document, after you identify these so-called specific objectives and the corresponding research questions, it turns out that then the expectation is that you're going to conduct a detailed literature review. A detailed literature review, which ideally is supposed to be aligned with the specific objectives, okay? And this is interesting. We've already started touching on to something I always like to explicitly stress, this notion that what we are referring to as
you're not getting a bit of coverage.
Yeah.
Hmm?
I don't know if that's a question.
Okay.
No?
No?
I think somebody is
Someone's
sitting here, and I think it's Mr. Geshu who asked, thought that was a question.
No.
To mute him. There's something interesting about literature review, and I think we'll touch on this important issue once we have a dedicated discussion of literature review process, right? So this notion that if you sit down and think about it, right, it turns out that virtually at each and every stage of the research process, you conduct some kind of literature review, right? If you think about these steps we're talking about, right, we're saying we define problem, we don't have to do this, so I'll use this instead of typing again. Virtually each and every stage, right, of your quote-unquote research process here involves some kind of mild literature review, right? If you think about the very first stage here, which is where most of you are, most of us, I suppose. Well, for the doctoral students, I think most of you have probably already identified the problem, right? So you make an observation, and then you identify a problem or something. This is what we're talking about here, isn't it? If you step back a little and you ask yourself important question, how do we find a problem to work on? Well, everything obviously starts off, if you look at science broadly, everything starts off with an observation. We have observed that there's a lot of misinformation, right, during this period as it relates to Zambia, right, because it's an election period. What kind of misinformation? Well, everybody has suddenly become an expert, right? Everybody on social media will type some very weird story, and it's difficult to tell whether or not what they've written about is true, is factual or not, right? So misinformation. Okay, so we've identified that there's a problem there. If you're a PhD student, right, the next thing you're going to have to do here is before you actually focus on that particular problem, you're going to have to read a little, right? So you do some kind of mild literature review, literature synthesis, right? You are reading in essence. In fact, if you think about it, right, a problem like the one I just stated about misinformation, typically you wouldn't be the one who would identify that problem. You probably come across that problem after you read about something. So some people, certain key experts here, maybe journalists, who hint at the fact that we've noticed that there's a lot of non-factual information that is being written about, right? So you use that as a basis to cover out a problem. What you're doing is doing a mild literature review. It turns out that identification of problems, right, can also be done by way of reading. I'm doing this with a number of my students, doctoral students. They had their initial concept notes, quite all right. But what we've had to do is we had to double back, right? And we are saying, well, the thing that you stated as being your preferred focus area clearly has already been worked on by a number of people, right? I would typically throw classic research problems at them, right? Say there are these people that have done research a lot associated with what you're proposing to do. At PhD level, you have to explicitly state what is different, right? Between what is already there and what you're proposing to do. So what do? We have to go and read. So we're doing some mild literature review. Well, this dedicated stage here, again, we can skip this here because we know this is like literature review kind of, right? When you're formulating a research problem, you cannot formulate a research problem in isolation, right? You'd have to do some kind of literature review as well, right? If we go to the experimental design phase or study design phase here, where we're testing experimentation, well, you begin to realize that you're going to be making reference to factual information, like, well, we use the Slovene sample size formula to compute, to come up with an appropriate sample size associated with our target population. And what you're going to do when you're writing that you use Slovene sample size formula is you're going to be citing where people can read up a bit more about the Slovene sample size formula. You're probably going to talk about, well, we use the mixed methods, the sequential mixed methods design, if you will. Okay? For people to know what that is, you're going to cite. It turns out that there's some literature review happening, although in that particular case, you're not really explicitly hunting for related work, but rather background information, right? When it comes to, I don't know about data collection here, maybe a bit of mild literature review here, I guess, when you want to cite specific data collection techniques that you are utilizing, like, we use the ethnography for us to collect the data or something, or for people to understand what type of ethnographic approach you utilize, you'd have to cite information, right? Or we use the participant observations, right? You cite. When you cite, you reference. So you're doing some kind of literature review, kind of. Again, when you're doing your data analysis, typically you'd be citing specific techniques that you'd be utilizing there. During interpretation is when you actually make extensive use of related work, right? Because for you to support the explanations that you have about the findings, right? You typically would be making reference to what other people would have done. Okay, so we say, well, our results are aligned with work that was done by Banda et al. Or something, by Wheeler et al. Right? Anyways, so the long and short of it here is we're saying that we went through the 7-step research process, and I was when I went to the literature review here, I was reminding us that the reason why we seem to be jumping here, it appears we're jumping, is because you actually do conduct literature review at virtually each stage of the research process. During some stages, it may be very extensive. In other stages, it may not really be as extensive. Okay. So it turns out that before we can actually start, understanding exactly how we carve out so-called research problems, how we write a problem statement, and how we derive objectives and subsequent research questions from then, we need to first of all define the problem, right? And we mentioned that the research process actually starts with the recognition of the problem or an opportunity that exists. Problems are all over, is it? Typically in science, it starts off with an observation. You know, why is it that we don't see a lot of birds, right? In 2026 compared to many years ago or something. We made an observation, right? Why is it that certain bird species are no longer, we no longer observe certain bird species when you go to places such as Lusaka National Park, right? You start off with an observation. Why is it that we have an increase in misinformation? All of a sudden there's a spike, right? Okay. So it starts off with an observation, make an observation, right? You identify a problem for observation here. And what we said was that you as a researcher should start off by identifying the problem that you want to study. Okay, so your interest, ideally. It's not always the case, well, I guess implicitly it is. I'll give you an example, right? There was a call for expression of interest, I believe, from Smart Zambia Institute, and a colleague of mine, Professor Masaiti, reached out to me, and so we're putting together an expression of interest. Now, if you think about it, right, one would argue that in that particular case, we implicitly, right, singled out the problem we want to study. Not that we conceptualize the problem, somebody else has already identified the problem, but we, by submitting an expression of interest, sort of like have decided that we want to focus in that particular area. It's quite common actually in research. Most of the things that people in the department are doing by way of research, for instance, are not necessarily things that they may explicitly have been interested in, but somebody identified a problem or broad problem areas, and then they issued out a call for proposals. If you're interested, submit a proposal, right? But generally you phrase that proposal in such a way that it's aligned with your research areas. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because in your case, there's two paths here. When you are defining this problem, if you're a doctoral student, either you will identify the problem, or your supervisor will propose something, right? Now, because at doctoral level, part of what you're being assessed on is they try to assess whether you are capable of conducting what's called independent research. Your supervisor is not going to tell you to say go and work on this problem, but maybe he'll give you a reference, right? To say, you know, there's this project, and what you can do is, you know, try and see if you can find your way and cover out a problem from this particular project, right? Quite common actually. Very common. So because usually what happens is that when you get a research grant, if it's a substantial research grant, it's typically done over a prolonged period of time, right? Years in some instances. So in that period of time, you have master's students, sometimes undergraduate students and doctoral students, even postdocs, come in and work on sub-problems, right? So the idea is you want to make sure that the things that they're working on are somewhat interconnected, right? So either you identify a problem here or supervisor will propose a problem for you. Now, if you think about it, right, whether a supervisor identifies a problem or they propose doesn't take away the fact that it may be aligned with your research interests. Is it because part of the reason why you've been probably paired with your current supervisor is because your supervisor has worked in your preferred area of interest, if that makes sense. You know, if that makes sense. I don't know if this is making sense here. Because it turns out that these people tend to specialize, is it? So if we look up specific individuals in, I guess we can look at specific people here, you notice that they specialize, right? So if you look at Professor Piri, for instance, his focus areas, if you look at the things that he has published in, you notice that the underlying themes are somewhat aligned to these broad areas here. So cybersecurity, you know, applied AI and business informatics. You will never find anything to do with cybersecurity in my portfolio, right? It's not there. It's simply not going to find it there, right? If that makes sense here. Not that I'm not interested. I can probably teach. I can teach some of these courses, but I just don't do research in those areas, right? You notice that the things that I've been working on somewhat align in these broad areas here. Okay, so you specialize, and the idea is at some point you probably be paired up with a supervisor who probably works in areas that are aligned with your preferred research interests. Granted, these broad areas, you know, at a very high level, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because Professor Piri says he does cybersecurity, then anything to do with cybersecurity he's an expert in. No. But anyway, so what we're saying is, at the very beginning, you must single out the problem. And I do hope at the very beginning I had asked, I think I'd reminded people to say, we had encouraged you to start thinking about topics that you would want to work on, right? And the nice way of identifying a topic is you start with an interest. Simply saying I'm interested in artificial intelligence here is not going to be very helpful, right? What exactly are you interested in about AI? You know, is it computer vision? Is it natural language processing? Right? What about computer science are you actually interested in? Is it human-computer interaction? Right? Is it data management? Is it distributed systems? And in fact, all of these, what I'm referring to here, what one would call subcategories here, right? Subcategorizations of computing in general. But an interest here must be tied to a topic, right? So I'm interested in streamlining medical workflows. I'm interested in machine learning techniques that have the potential to identify student performance, right? Using data, for instance. Anyways, so you start off with an interest, okay? This interest, typically a nice way of figuring out what it is you're going to work on here is you read and you talk to people. You must read and you talk to people. Most of the things that I've found myself doing here, believe you me, I have actually started working on them because I talked to people. Okay, the Enterprise Medical Imaging in Zambia project was a direct result of interactions that I had early on in the process back in 2021, 2020, 2021, right, with radiologists, right? And it turns out that one of these radiologists I was interacting with back then is a very dear friend of mine. So we meet and, you know, we are meeting informally here, but we'll be talking about some of these things, and then gradually we realize we can carve out problems, right? Like that. But also, you know, you tend to find problems through lived experiences, if that makes sense, right? So most of you have probably been working at your respective places here for years now. And as you're working for years, I'm pretty sure, even months actually, I'm pretty sure you've identified what you may call pain points, right? It's like if you're in the telecommunications sector, for instance, because I know a number of people that are doing data science here are working for, you know, Zamtel and all those things here. It's like, why is it that sales and marketing are using manual approaches, right? For their targeted campaigns, for instance. That's a problem right there, is it? Why is it a problem? Well, it's inefficient, it's ineffective, it's not sustainable like that. Now, if that's a problem, then what I can do is I can probably suggest a solution, maybe an AI-driven solution or something like that, right? Anyways, so understanding a problem really involves discussing it with your colleagues so that they help you understand the thing here. Now, the goal, ideally, when it comes to what we're doing in this lecture series, is want to get to a stage where we know exactly how to write a problem statement. We want to also get to a stage where we know exactly how to phrase specific objectives and the main objective, so that we can insert all those things into something similar to what you're seeing right now, a paper, right? In this particular case, this was a conference proceeding paper. So in the conference proceeding paper, a research publication, a query research output, the expectation is you must explicitly state that the objectives of the research questions. In some instances, especially for conference proceeding papers, you tend to be conservative here in terms of space, because there are constraints. You're typically limited to a certain number of pages, okay, using a predefined template or something. Because of that, you cherry pick. Maybe you just include the specific objectives and you let people infer the questions associated with those objectives, or we can include the research questions. So we want to get to a stage where we're able to put together a paper like this. Okay, now simply put here, I guess if you're asking, what exactly is a research problem, seeing as we are interested in carving out research problems and specific objectives and all of those things here. A research problem is ideally a specific issue, problem or difficulty, contradiction, or a gap in knowledge, right, existing literature, that guides the focus of the research. Okay, so what we're calling a research problem here can be a specific issue, a challenge, a problem, a contradiction, or a gap. For some of these things, right, it's kind of interesting here. One would assume the gap that we've identified here is a lot of spam messages are sent to mobile devices. Is it? I mean, it's a difficulty, I guess one would say. Misinformation, specific issue or something. But some of these things like contradictions and gaps in knowledge, you only get to kind of figure them out when you read existing literature, right? But the long and short of it really is that this so-called research problem helps you define the scope and the direction of the research project itself. Okay, because if we use an example of spam, for instance, if you don't carefully phrase the problem, right, there's so much that we can look at, right? If you look at the issue as it relates to I'll just call this it's not even properly phrased here, but too many spam messages on MNO networks, right? So mobile network operators networks here. Now, if you think about it, right, too many messages, okay? Well, I want to quantify, right? Quantify. Like, how bad is the problem? How serious is this problem? I can choose to quantify spam messages, right? So how often do people receive spam messages? I can choose to say, well, I want to figure out which networks are mostly affected or something, right? What else? I can choose to say, I want to figure out what are MNOs currently doing, right? What are stakeholders currently doing, right? Now, if you're following through with what I'm trying to say here, it turns out that you can potentially have unlimited things that you can do, right? When you have something that is vague. And so a well-framed problem statement will help you come up with a specific scope and direction for the study. Right? And we see exactly how we do this here. Because in fact, some of the things that you'd be asking here, some of the things that you can potentially focus on insofar as this thing here, this vague problem is concerned, may have little to do with computer science. You know, some of these may just involve you conducting some surveys or something. You know, how do these spam messages adversely affect people, right? Or users or subscribers on these MNOs, for instance. Right. So a well-crafted problem helps you define the appropriate scope and direction for the study. And this is very important, right? I always, early on in the process, for most of my students, especially master's students, I guess, and sometimes doctoral students, it's hard, right, to help them appreciate the importance of ensuring that their problem statement is well framed, well phrased, right? So that you're very clear what exactly it is you're going to be doing. And you better make sure that what you're doing is aligned with the program that you're pursuing. So for instance, if you claim that you're doing a PhD in artificial intelligence, the expectation is that your research direction is going to be tied to that domain itself, right? People want, not by people here, I'm talking about the examiners here, they're not going to be kind towards you here. If you're going to veer away from AI and you're talking about things that are to do with information technology or information systems, right? So I want to be very careful here about scope. Anyways, but also we see here that this research problem, a well-framed research problem, will provide a clear purpose and set the stage for your research. This is the beginning of what I've been referring to as the golden thread idea, right? The problem is supposed to help you explicitly state the goal, the purpose of the study itself. I'm working with a doctoral student who is interested in kind of special education here. I forget if Gavin is doing a PhD in AI or something, or if it's in computer science here, but his interest is on automated interpretation of Zambian Sign Language, right? The goal, the purpose of the study is to, I guess, to determine or to investigate the extent towards which Zambian Sign Language can be automated, right? You notice here that there's some sort of clarity in terms of what it is he's wanting to do, right? It's tied to education idea. And also, the problem, the research problem, provides the basis for formulating the questions and, where applicable, hypotheses, right? So remember I was mentioning the golden thread. You have a problem, you make an observation, you identify a problem. That problem is going to be used to carve out a main objective, the purpose. The main objective will then enable you to derive specific objectives. The specific objectives will be used as a basis to flesh out the research questions, right? And the corresponding hypotheses. Educated guesses, they're called. Okay, so there's a method to the madness ideally here. What else? We see here that the problem is going to help you highlight relevance and potential impact of your research. And it's quite important really, because if you think about this from the perspective of where different portions of what you're doing are going to sit here, typically your introduction will have like the background or context, right? Context. It will have things like introduction, problem statement, right? Objectives, questions. And then at some point, right, you will have something like significance of the study. Always, this will always be there. Well, this is expected. In fact, I challenge you, for those of you that haven't really done this, if you go to the institutional repository for the UNZA, IRIMIS, I guess, if you go to the institutional repository for the UNZA, and you just narrow down to quote unquote the thesis and dissertations, right? If you go to this collection here, this community rather not collection, thesis community, and if I were you, actually I would probably go to, I don't know if you're able to get to the different schools. It's a thing here. These people, you know, they've messed things up, but that's okay also. I'm not complaining. If you look at all of these different theses and dissertations, right, what you begin to notice is that, wait a minute, these things here, right, these things here, almost all of them have, unless if a student really decided to do weird things here, all of them will have these things that we're discussing here. So if we go to here, all of them will have the problem statement, and then 1.6, significance of the study. It must always be there. The only way you'll be able to determine the significance of the study is if you have a well-framed research problem, ideally. But also, colleagues, you know, the reason why it's there, we know, right? Is because they've told us, apparently, no, you must, I guess, I don't know, you must, when you're writing your proposal or your final report, there must be significance. There must be significance of the study. It must be there, I guess. So kind of implicitly are telling you a template of your manuscript, I guess. I don't know. Maybe not. But anyway, so what we're saying is that the research problem, right, will enable you to highlight the relevance and the potential impact of your research. Okay? And then also it guides the identification of appropriate existing literature. This is why your supervisor, if you're probably at an advanced stage, a doctoral candidate at an advanced stage, or perhaps you're a master's student and you're already on your way to part 2, at some point, your supervisor told you something when you are writing your proposal, actually. He told you something, right? Say, in your related work, typically in your related work, you have themes, right? You have themes, generally. So if we go to this thing here, the themes for this person, see now, I prefer to annotate things. It's a lot easier to annotate things rather than using that thing here, the browser viewer here. But what you notice is that if you go to your typical literature review, this is horrible though. Not really, I guess, to a certain extent. What you may call the themes here would be the level 1. Colleagues, I don't know about writing here. I don't know where this came from, right? Okay, maybe the writing style I'm used to here. There's never a section 2.0, but I don't know also. The themes here, the themes would be your level 1. They're the level 1. Typically, it's a level 1 sections. Okay, so 2.1 theme, supply chain. 2.2 vegetable supply chains in developed economies. Right? What comes later here, like the level 3 hierarchies here in this particular here, 2.2.1 and 2.2.2. This is overkill here. I don't know about that, right? These are your themes, right? These are what we are calling themes here. And if you pay particular attention to a given manuscript here, you begin to notice that these themes that people come up with here, types of vegetable, food waste or something, and causes of food waste along vegetable, I don't know what. We should have checked maybe a computer science thing here. It's weird, but research is research, right? It turns out that these things, these are what we're calling themes here. If you go to your chapter, if you go to your chapter 1 for this person and you look at the specific objectives, you notice that there's a striking similarity, right? Or there's a link between these 4 objectives here and the themes. So he's saying to establish major types of food waste, to determine factors. Okay, but this was poorly written. What is this? Okay, maybe not poorly written, but disorganized kind of thing here, right? This is a Master of Science here. Wow, I don't know what this is. This is a bit weird here. But the thing is that the expectation the easiest way of coming up with related work is that you use these specific objectives, these, as a way to identify themes, right? Themes. So in other words, I'm going to double back and look at the paper that I had control over. If you look at this, to quantify Wikipedia content contribution about Zambia by Zambians, to determine levels of awareness and willingness, to identify perceived motivation factors, to design and implement a software that will use gamification and whatever. The expectation is that at a bare minimum, the related work section is going to have themes that are aligned with these specific objectives. The golden thread. I don't know if I have this yet to showcase. I think but it's not there also, so exit. This is the paper itself, right? Now, if you go to chapter 2, you'll notice that we have specific themes here: content contribution, awareness, and willingness. Quantify, right? Quantifying, the first one. Content contribution, awareness, willingness, and motivation. Objective 2 and 3, right? 2.3, the last objective we were talking about, gamification. So in other words, colleagues, what we are saying is that, what we are saying is that the research problem is going to guide you on what you should focus your attention on, right? You're identifying appropriate existing literature. And you will soon see when we get to our discussion on literature review that I think this can be a very daunting task, although things have changed now. But if we look at just Wikipedia content contribution or something, this is a bit of an historic field here. If I just key in that, right, it's like 500,000 papers. You can't read all of these, and I know what you're thinking. Oh, but we can filter light on, right? So we focus on the state of the art. Okay, and if we even start from 2022 or something, it's still 16,900 articles. This is way too much, right? Yeah, but if you have a well-framed problem, that problem is going to lead you down the path where you identify specific objectives, and ultimately, it will help you identify appropriate existing literature, relevant things, right? A restricted set of literature that is relevant to whatever it is you're doing, research-wise. What else? Well, we see here that the problem is going to help guide the effective allocation of project resources. Very important. I had an interaction with somebody I can't remember what we were talking about. I don't know if it was a lecture we had or something. I don't know here, right? I think it was a lecture we had about the budget or something. There we go, right? The problem is going to enable you to effectively allocate whatever resources you have at your disposal to conduct this research. Like it or not, for us to carry out this research, we needed resources, right? People to collect data. There you go. Money, right? To do some of the things we're doing. There you go. In some instances, you may be required to travel, right? Especially at PhD, the data collection is expected to be quite comprehensive, right? So you'll be moving around doing interviews, collecting data, right? Visiting certain offices. I have 2 master's students that I've been working with who are part of the road safety project, Chisomo and Henry. And they've had to make frequent visits to places of Lusaka City Council, RDA. I remember, is it last year, we made about 2 visits to RDA together, right? To go and do presentations and to interact with people from RDA. We're burning fuel, right? You have to make phone calls here. It turns out that a well-framed problem is going to help you. It will help guide the effective allocation of resources. For some of you, especially at PhD level, they will help you figure out that at some point here, we'll need research assistants, right? So best you do it early on in the process so that your supervisor knows. When your supervisor knows, sometimes they can do very smart things like next year, they carve out a research project, an undergraduate research project that is aligned with what you're doing, that will enable you to do some of the things that you're unable to do on your own, right? Because you need more resources. It's very common approach. I haven't really used it extensively during my stay at UNZA, but I know my supervisor, my doctoral supervisor, did this a lot. So at the beginning of every year, he would reach out to his doctoral students, for instance. If you're interested in carving out a capstone project and you're willing to co-supervise undergraduate students, capstone project that will help you achieve some of the goals, by all means do, right? Anyway, so is that. And then what else? You see that the problem provides you with benchmarks for evaluating the outcome of the research, right? Evaluation is key here, the relative success of the research. This is so the problem will help you with that starting point here. So hopefully this gives us an appreciation of why it's important for us to have a well-framed research problem. We'll look at characteristics of a good research problem, I guess. But for now, I think what's important is we appreciate the role of a research problem. I'm going to cruise through these things because we discussed them during the introduction. This is just a way of reminding us that we can view research from different dimensions based on what sort of research problem we are undertaking, right? In some fields, the focus is, or generally what we do is we conduct exploratory research, right? Where we find ourselves exploring an unknown or an understudied area, ideally. Okay, so why is it that students these days don't attend classes? You know, we conduct an exploratory research or something. The research can also be descriptive, where you're attempting to describe characteristics, is it, or functions of a specific phenomenon here. Okay, so usually in this particular case, you're trying to describe what is happening. Perhaps if we were to link this to our spam hypothetical problem here, you want to describe why certain MNOs have more spam messages being sent to their subscribers than others, right? If that makes sense. Research can also be explanatory, right? You're trying to explain a phenomenon, right? So typically this is a research where you are focusing on trying to identify variables that have some sort of causal relationship amongst them, right? Why is it that females perform way better than males at grade 12, right? It's classic explanatory research, if you will. Well, that's trivial because people have already done studies about that, is it? If that makes sense here. But the goal here is to try and understand why things happen, right? Why do, okay, I'm not trying to be political here, but okay, maybe we can carve it out as a research problem also. It's been mentioned that voting in most instances in the Republic here is done, there's some regional bias or something, is it? If that makes sense. I don't know, you may want to explain that, don't know. But also research can be predictive, right? Where you're trying to predict future occurrences based on current or historical data. Some of you guys, especially the people that are doing data science, will probably be conducting predictive research, right? You're trying to do projections here. Using historical records, you're trying to figure out what is going to happen in the future, okay? So you'll be building models, for instance, or frameworks for forecasting future trends. Interestingly enough, I've been supervising a student who's been interested in trying to do a projection on, I don't know if you've heard of the so-called JCTR basic needs and nutrition basket. The way this works is that, and it was there again, right? Because it's a political thing here because of politics, everybody's singing about that. I don't know if you guys have seen the, it was there also, JCTR BNNB for June 2026. It was there, everybody was talking about this, right? Apparently, the cost of living has increased by 349 quarters. It's crazy out there. But also, this is usually the focus is on Lusaka, but what JCTR does is they do a BNNB. They compile BNNB values here for for all the major towns, I guess, and cities in the Republic here, right? But the focus is on, I guess, Lusaka typically, right? So they do this, right? Now, this is for the family of Lusaka, the family of 5 in Lusaka. It's crazy out there. But the thing is, the way the BNNB works here is, if you notice, the JCTR published this in July. Okay, this is the BNNB for June, is it? Right? So typically, this is done retrospectively. What JCTR does is they report the cost of living for the previous month, generally. So this month, in July, they reported the June BNNB. The July BNNB will only be reported in August. That's like, the reason why they do this, by the way, is their focus is on trying to guide policy as it relates to this, right? So when they make a lot of noise like this, probably the number of policies that can be introduced or something, or interventions that can be introduced, that will probably lower the cost here. But if you think about it, right, the argument that Mr. Annette Mlenga is making is that, well, the average person, like you, for instance, you wouldn't really find this very useful. Somebody is telling you the cost of living for last month. It's like, I know, because I have I have details of what I spent last month. So what are you telling me, right? At an individual level. What she's doing, though, is she's building models that are going to predict the values into the future. So we're in July right now. She's building models that will predict the cost of these foodstuffs, right? I don't know if you guys have, but I don't know also. I don't know if you guys have, but what is this now? I don't know if you guys have bothered to look into the BNNB reports, right? It's a rich data set, by the way. Guys, for those of you that are doing data science, if you're interested in this stuff here, please let me know. Maybe we can what is this? BNNB, BNNB, I'll call this 2024 or something. Don't know if it's, but why? You know, sometimes I don't understand, right? This is, can't find, this is insane here. I'm just going to unzip the September BNNB. There we go. Is and you know, these people, they always use rich text. I'm not complaining, but so this is what they do, right? I'll use my hometown here because I love my hometown very much. This is RTF, so I have to explicitly do it open with. You know what Ms. Mlenga is doing is, because the BNNB report is quite detailed, right? It tell you first where exactly this data was collected, right? So methodology, data collection methodology. They'll tell you we went to Navutika market, to Kapata market, and all these markets. I grew up there. Saturday market and Chini market and ShopRite and Magazine market, right? To sample the prices for these foodstuffs. So what Annette is doing is she's saying, well, we know, we appreciate what we know, and we appreciate what is that? What JCTR is doing, right? To tell us what the cost of living was last month. But what we want to do is build models, right? That will tell the average person to say, we are currently in July. In August, the cost of living is going to move or reduce or whatever. It's going to be, there's going to be a shift here from 8,000 to maybe 9,000. And more importantly, right, she's looking at specific commodities here. The cost of meal is going to move from, I don't know what is it, 246 kwacha 18 way to whatever amount into the future, right? You're doing a projection, it's a forecasting idea. I don't know if that makes sense. It's predictive, I guess. You know, if that makes sense here. But also, we can view research from the perspective of what is done as part of action research, right? Where you're conducting participatory research, right? Ideally, in this particular case, you'd embed yourself in a particular environment to try and understand how people do things, right? So you're combining practice and theory ideally, so that you identify how exactly you can improve the way things are done. We rarely have students doing technical courses like the computing programs we offer conduct action research, although it is possible. I have a colleague of mine, a very dear colleague of mine. His name is Colin Stanley or something. I'm trying to showcase to you that this is something that Colin Stanley, he's now DVC or something like that, I guess, somewhere right there. Colin Stanley. He's now, well, CT. He's DVC at UNAM or something. That's it. He was doing code designs. It's classic HCI, but he embedded himself with there's this tribe in Namibia, right? I don't know if it's a Hamba tribe or something, and I think one of these things, him collecting data or something like that. I think this is Colin Stanley here, somewhere here, right? So what he was doing was classic code design here, but there was a bit of participatory or action research ideally, if that makes sense. That is Colin Stanley. Yes, I think he was still young by then. He has gray hair now, I guess. So there's that as well. We rarely have, I don't know what's happening with our students here. We don't typically have, in the last, I would say, 7, 8 years I've been at the UNZA, I have not once come across a student who has actually done action research, right? Or classic human-computer interaction. It's usually these controlled studies or something, user experience and usability tests and all those things, right? So, and typically they'll be doing that as part of the evaluation, really, but it's rarely the case that they'll embed themselves in a given environment, and rightfully so, right? Because it turns out that the way research works is students who tend to gravitate more towards what faculty staff in that particular department are doing. I know that Colin Stanley was working with Professor Blake and Professor Marsden, I think before he died or something at some point, right? And those people were really into mainstream classical HCI, human-computer interaction. So there's that. But anyway, just wanted to mention here that we can view research from that sort of perspective as well, right? But really, irrespective of what you're looking at here, it turns out that these different types of research problems can actually be categorized into 3 broad categories, right? So you'd probably find yourself integrating existing knowledge, right? Where you're synthesizing and organizing already existing information to create comprehensive and accessible body of knowledge. Or you may find yourself solving a problem with no known solution. We don't know if we can predict elections in Zambia using social media data. Don't know, you know? This is a problem with no known solution. I guess I don't know but if that's, so you'll be solving that sort of problem to find a solution to a problem that has not yet been solved. I want to argue here that the thing that Annette is doing here, right, falls in that broader category here. We don't have a known solution, right? To the best of my knowledge, I mean, probably there are solutions, I guess. There are smart people that work at Zambia Statistical Agency, you know, Ministry of Finance. I don't know what sort of projections they do. The extent towards which they do these things is restricted to my knowledge of what I find here, Zambia Statistics Agency here. If you look at their publications, they do publish some of these things, but it's hard to tell if they do this sort of projections, right? It's classically integration, really, but that's okay. Maybe here, not that. But also, right, you would find yourself improving an existing solution or method, right? Where you are focusing on revisiting and enhancing an existing method or a solution. For those of you that are doing AI, I guess at master's level, maybe some of you will work towards optimizing an existing algorithm or estimator, right? Or modifying it, right? So that you come up with a better, a more effective or efficient algorithm or something. So you're improving an existing solution or method. If you're doing IS, typically, typically you would probably come up with a framework which is going to be a modified version of an already established theory, existing theory, right? So you come up with a modified version of the term 2 technology technology acceptance model theory here, right? A modified version, right? Or a modified version of UTAUT or something like that. Yeah, so you'd be improving an existing solution or method. Or maybe you're improving it by way of contextualizing it to a unique environment where you're coming from, like Zambia or Sub-Saharan Africa or something like that. Right. So typically you do some you can cluster all these different research problems into these 3 broad areas. And usually, right, if you're at PhD level, you're doing masters by research, the expectation is going to be that you're explicitly mentioning the novelty of what you're doing relative to how exactly you're improving, you're adding to the existing body of knowledge. I remember, this all of our PhDs, by the way, in case you didn't know this, I think I've tried as much as I can here to record presentations, I think, there. So the Vivas, I record them because in my role as postgraduate coordinator or something, I don't know if I was also recording the questions that were being asked by the general public. Maybe not. But this is me saying that what you may want to do is, if you look up my name and you just say Viva Watch or something, or Viva, you probably come across most of the recordings I've done, right, for presentations that have been done in our department. Okay, and I always record presentations or oral presentations or exams for all my students. Anyways, so it gives you an idea of what sort of questions they'll ask, right? And usually, if you're a master's by research student or a doctoral student, they'll always ask, right, what was your contribution to the body of knowledge? And the nice way of thinking about the contribution of the body of knowledge is by looking at it from the perspective of these 3 broad categories. So you say, well, methodologically, what we did is we improved what is currently there by doing ABCD, right? Or we proposed a new theory or something. If you're doing IS, typically, if you're doing IS, you're most likely going to propose some new framework or something like that. I don't know. Anyways, so there's that, right? Now, it turns out really that it's worth mentioning here that most research studies that are conducted and fundamentally are not really original, right? Most studies that would be done at doctoral level in higher education institutions would be fundamentally original, but not all research conducted is original. Okay? I want to pause here and think, right? Think about commissioned research that is done by entities like Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Education, right? In some instances, they're just looking at you conducting research so that they can inform policy direction. So it may not necessarily be original, if you will, here. But what's important to appreciate here is that originality, right, can be linked to some aspects, right, of the research itself. Maybe the topic, right? So the topic itself may be original, maybe nobody else has done that, right? The approach you're taking, right? At master's level here, this is quite sad, but I guess I'm and this is where this is important here, right? I don't know if this is a good thing. I don't know to what extent the University of Zambia Director of Research and Graduate Studies is trying to clamp down on this, right? What you will notice, and I think I mentioned this, if you start, these are dissertations, right? 5,656. If you just look at the titles, right? You will, and I wish there's a way of kind of, I don't know if we can filter out type, we can't. And we wanted to see if we could filter out the type based on whether it's a PhD or master's or something. But what you begin to notice, right, is that there's something very strange about the topics, the titles of these dissertations, right? a case study of Soweto market in Lusaka, right? The case of First National Bank Zambia, right? I don't know if you're noticing this. I'm sure there's some of our students that have already started doing this, right? I know one of my students is like in Mchinga province or something, but we're going to come down on that. A case of Lusaka district of Zambia. You know why they're doing this? Well, they're trying to come up with an argument for why what they're doing is novel, right? Because if you look at the first part here, assessment of factors causing food waste along vegetable supply chain, there is tons of people that have done this. There's nothing novel about that. What makes this novel? Well, the context, right? Now, yes, this is Soweto in Lusaka. I guess we can come up with an argument, right, for why you're obsessing so much about Soweto and FNB Zambia or something, if that makes sense. But you notice that almost all our postgraduate students who have this, they are running away from, well, not really running away, I guess. You're trying to explain what is so novel about what you did, right? Lusaka, Zambia, right? It's always contextualized. It's quite sad. All of these are cases on Lusaka, Zambia. Lusaka, Zambia, right? Lusaka, Zambia. I'm happy to say that this is something we work on with most of my students, especially if they're doing masters by research or PhD, right? Our goal is to contribute to the body of knowledge internationally. Is it? Unfortunately, if you do this, right, usually you have a very, very difficult time to publish in a top-tier journal, and you make an argument to say this was done in Lusaka or something. That's not novel or something, you know, in the classical sense anyway. You know, if you notice, all of them, right, it's Zambians. I guess one would argue that maybe this points at lack of creativity or something. I don't know. Maybe not. I'm not trying to say anything here, but also I don't know. So what we're saying here is that originality can be looked at from so many different aspects, right? Or angles, the topic, you know, the approach, right? The results, you know, the application area, for instance. Okay. Something else to mention here is that if a given area is relatively new, research contribution can be linked to problems that have not yet adequately been addressed. Give you an example. If you're doing AI, right? If you're doing a PhD in AI, now this is gone here. You know, so at some point, this was a pretty novel space, right? Looking at aspects to do with large language models. Although gradually, I mean, this has become so saturated, right? Because prior to the introduction of GPT model here, there was nothing to do with LLMs, right? So it was a relatively new area, ideally. Okay, if that makes sense. What else here? Turns out that well-established fields would typically require expert guidance in order to ensure that one studies a suitable aspect. So in other words, I guess this is me saying this is one of the reasons why at higher education institutions like the UNZA, they will say a master's student and a doctoral student must be assigned supervisors. They're considered experts in that area, right? They'll be the ones to help guide you. And I'm sure if you're a doctoral student, you've already started having these conversations with your supervisors, right? To do with novelty. So they're guiding you and telling you, oh, go and read this, right? Why don't you look at what you're proposing to do from this particular angle, right? Course correcting. They're acting as an expert, ideally. Now, the long and short of it here really is when I'm talking about problems here, right? For you to find or to identify an appropriate problem here, the best starting point is look at things that excite you, especially if you're doing PhD, right? We're talking about 3-4 years, maybe more, right? Whenever, and you know this from experience, whenever you find yourself doing something that spans multiple months or multiple years here, excitement sometimes will die away, right? Especially if you lose interest quickly if you're doing something that doesn't excite you, is what I'm trying to say here. You know, so you want to make sure that you start off with something that excites you. You know, sometimes maybe you can start off with something that is of particular interest to a community you associate yourself with. So a community here could be where you work, right? You spend a significant proportion of your time here at work. I'm sure there are problems there. These are probably problems that you experience in your day-to-day duties as an employee, or maybe there could be problems that you've just identified, right? Working in that space. It's usually a lot easier here. So you start off with something that excites you and the community. Usually when you're identifying something that excites or something that interests the community, it becomes a lot easier for you to get buy-in from the community, is what we're trying to say here. If I was to tell people here, and I've tried here, right? I'm not tell you this here, in terms of the community. Very few people I've spoken to. I guess it's because people don't really understand what it is we're doing here. But when we started working on this, and I talked to people about what it is we're doing, right? You have very weird reactions from people, right? What's so special about Wikipedia? This was before when you started working on this was before the LLM era here, right? So people look at you strange here because they don't, if you look at Zambia, right? People are not really worried about the fact that there's very little content created by Zambians on Wikipedia. They're obsessed with the hunger, right? Is it? And education, right? This is the obsession, is it? So they won't really, from the perspective of the community here, they won't really value what you're doing here. But there always has to be a thin line here. And also, I guess this is a part where people like me really enjoy working in academia, right? The fact that even if the average person in Zambia doesn't really care or doesn't really see the need of me conducting research in Wikipedia, I do this. And every year, almost every year, I have a student working on this. I do this because it excites me, right? So I'm interested in this space. And there are very few places, by the way, if you look at a typical workplace, where you'd have the autonomy to work on things that excite you. I do at UNZA, right? So if you're an academic, nobody's going to, tell you to say you must research in this area. You're free to work on whatever research problems you find exciting or interesting. Although sometimes you're implicitly forced when it comes to funding, is it? Because these funding agencies will have priority areas ideally, right? If you look at the things to do with Wikipedia, the only place where you get funding here is Wikimedia, the Wikimedia Foundation. And so they do give out grants here and research and all, research funds and all that, but it's hard to get money like that, right? But anyways, so what else here? Your supervisor as well, right? We help you identify problem. In some instances, collaborators. And I know at this stage, identifying collaborators may be difficult unless if you're introduced, these collaborators are introduced to you by your supervisor or something. But if you're an established researcher like myself, you will find that you will find people, right? You will find people that will enable you to conduct interdisciplinary research, right? Collaborators in different fields, right? These people, Dr. Zulu, Dr. Mbewe, Dr. Malhaza, Dr. Sichizia, Dr. Chuta. These are not computer, Zola is a computer scientist, obviously, but his interests here are completely different from mine, right? So you're able to identify, research problems through interactions with collaborators who I can collaborate with. This year, I'm collaborating with a colleague who is an expert in special education. We're starting out slow here. I've always had an interest in accessibility, and I see this as a starting point, really. So there are things like that. You want to talk to other people, really. By the way, in case you're wondering, how do I find collaborators, right? Attend academic events. If there's a conference taking place at UNZA, even if you're busy at work, find time, come through and attend just for a day, maybe one session. Identify the sessions that will excite you, you come and attend. If there's a major conference like an international conference or a regional conference like this conference here, TICON, which is taking place very, very soon, it's right there. How many of you are aware here? It's taking place in Livingston in September, right? Try and see if you can convince, most of you work for, your employers have a provision where they can actually sponsor you to go and attend this event. Try and see if you can secure funding and just go and attend this event and see what sort of interesting things people are going to be talking about, right? You go there, you will potentially find collaborators, ideally. Anyways, finding research problems, right? But when you're unfamiliar with the subject area, right, insofar as the research problem is concerned, what you want to do is, and I want to talk about this during our discussion on literature reviews here, but what you want to do here is you want to avoid going to bibliographic databases here like ACM digital libraries and all that as a starting point, right? Or reading up research articles. What you want to do is you want to, first of all, have a firm sense of the space you're working in. And typically, you take a top-down approach, right? You start off with books, right? Technical reports that have been produced, for instance, so that you understand the space first, okay? The goal is to obtain, a good background in the subject area before you start narrowing down on specifics here. And then, once you have that best knowledge that you need, you can then go to Google Scholar, A minor or semantic search, and you start, doing your focus search. Is it? There are a number of DPLP. There are a number of these academic databases, right? DBLP, A minor. We'll talk about these, I guess, when we start looking at literature review or something, right? So we're saying before you go to these bibliographic databases, you want to first of all have this best understanding, ideally. Unless if when you're going to search in these bibliographic databases, you're probably searching for review papers, if you will, right? That would be fine, ideally. Okay. Just to mention here that your secondary sources will also help summarize and integrate information on a given subject area, right? If that makes sense. Now, maybe just to kind of remind us, right, in terms of where we can potentially specific sources of problems, right, where we can find these problems. Personal experience, I think we've already mentioned this. Typically, if you've been working in a given environment for more than 2 years, I'm sure you can use your experience to try and identify these research problems, right? And these questions I had here, by the way, was to try and help us think about it from the perspective of literature review, to say, what sort of existing literature would we be wanting to read here, right? If we are looking at identifying problems via personal experience, right? You can conduct an explicit literature synthesis. I always tell students that this is a good starting point as well. So this notion that you start off from something that interests you. I'm interested in medical imaging. Okay. If you're interested in medical imaging, you better identify specific papers that you're going to be reading, state of the art, right? So you go to, I don't know, it's Google Scholar or something, and then you trim, you filter information that has been published in the last 3 years, right? And then you start reading. The idea about reading is that most of these publications, implicitly, sometimes explicitly, we will have something towards the end here, something similar to what we did here. Most of them, potential future work could involve large-scale nationwide survey, blah, 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 right? In addition, future work could explore the use of more widely used services like WhatsApp and all those things. Usually, in the conclusion, certainly in your manuscript, you will find people that will I don't know if these people would have done this here. They will state explicitly, if this is making sense here. Oh, yeah. They will state explicitly in the, but you don't include work planning. What's going on here? Why would you need a work planning? Okay, in the back, okay, that's okay. That's not me. But so usually, if you look at this, right, they'll have these things here. Future direction, right? The future research direction could focus on investigating on the following, investigating the, in the writing here, investigating the impact of packaging on food waste, right? If you know all of these, right? If you think about it, all of these are potential problems because this has not been done by this person. This person did the work for you and they've identified to say what you can potentially work on in the future are these areas. So you can carve out those things. Literature review is what we say. What else? Well, you can find these research problems from current events and social issues. I'll tell you this, right? Most of the time when I am, usually I don't have a TV at home, but also I hardly ever listen to the radio here. But usually when I'm going to work or coming back from work, I'll tune into the radio, and or when I'm driving long distance or something, I'm working from out of town, I'll tune onto the radio, right? And usually there are interesting conversations that will take place, right? Those conversations, especially interviews, will highlight important societal issues. ZNBC has a number of interview programs that they conduct. Movie TV as well has this, right? So you can use those as a basis to try and identify problems ideally. But also newspapers, right? I don't know how many of you read newspapers, but occasionally, every now and then, I will, I think it's on an ad hoc basis here, I will subscribe to Zambia Daily Mail. All right, I think it's, is it 5 quarts or something? Is it 10 quarts or something? Quarts, I think. So I'll do like, changed, I would do a subscription and then download, kind of like this here. That's right. There's usually a lot of interesting, this is A minor here. There's usually a lot of interesting things that you can find. And in the past, really, I've actually done this Zambia Day. Zambia. Oh, Daily Mail. In the past, I've actually, this is here, Daily Mail. In the past, I actually was subscribing to these things. Actually, I was compiling data set to be used as examples in these courses that I teach. Right. So you can find, what I'm trying to say here is you can find problems if you read. And I promised you here there, and I'm saying this because last week, I think, or is it the other week when we met, there was a question. Who asked this question? I think somebody, unless yeah. To reconnect, I guess. Give a thumbs up if you can hear me now. I think I'd lost my connection there. Oh, can you hear me? Thumbs up. Okay, you can probably hear me. Just record. I just noticed that my previous connection. I'm hoping you can hear me now. Thumbs up if you can hear me, please. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, beautiful. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for that. I don't know what's happening here, but it's wild out there. It's wild. Okay. Sorry about that, breaking transmission. I was just saying that you know, you can find these problems in mainstream media, right? So as you're watching TV with your family and all that, you probably want to pay particular attention, especially to these new news items, right? In fact, I spend a lot of, I don't have a TV myself, but I spend a lot of time watching these, you know, Facebook Reels, especially. Certainly I follow ZNBC, Movie TV, and all those things on Facebook. Sometimes if certain people are being interviewed, I will probably tune in or something. The same applies to YouTube, right? I'm subscribed to ZNBC and all those things. So it's a nice way of trying to get a sense of what is currently happening, ideally. You know, there are certain researchers that have done very radical things. I've certainly been wanting to do this with especially undergraduate students, right? Because they tend to especially experience problems when looking, have difficulties identifying problems. You know, so there are certain researchers that have done they've taken radical approaches where you just go with your students to some place, right? So you go to Soweto Market or you go to some high density area and you try and identify what can potentially be done there, right? You know, can there be something we can do to try and improve society from a sort of perspective here? To try and cut down from, if you look at most of the fourth year projects, right, most of them will be timetabling system, you know, bed space identification system and some crap like that. And I guess one would assume that, well, I guess they're looking at, from the perspective of their community here, they're looking at their community as being UNZA, right? So problems as they relate to UNZA. It's always fun looking at problems that students would propose. Anyway, so current events and societal issues, but also professional practice, right? You, right? If you teach for a living like Lighton, you use that sort of experience that you have to identify problems, right? If you work for the central bank, if you work for Zantel, right, you should be able to relate to the problems as they relate to your workplace or something. But also, interestingly enough, you can utilize established theoretical frameworks, right, or conceptual frameworks here to try and see how best you can identify an appropriate problem. Okay, and so the question then becomes, if we know where exactly we can find problems, right, what constitutes, right, a good research problem? And this is what we're interested in, because ultimately, when we identify a problem, irrespective of the source, whether it's your supervisor who tells you here's a problem, work on this, whether it's your supervisor who tells you go and read this, whether you found your problem yourself, ultimately that problem will have to be explicitly written down. Initially, in your research proposal document, if you're a doctoral student, at some point you have to carve out or write a research problem in 2 journal papers, 2 journal articles, and then finally in the manuscript itself, the report, right? So in other words, at some point, you're going to have to, I don't know where this is here. you're going to have to write down the problem in this sort of document here. So the question is, how exactly do we write this problem? What constitutes a good research problem? Well, there's certain characteristics we're going to talk about here, appreciate. And I would like to urge all of us to, as we are going through these characteristics going forward, we're going to discuss characteristics of good research problems, good objectives, good research questions. As we're doing this, you probably want to latch on to whatever problem or topic you've identified, so that we work together going forward, ideally, especially those of you that are doing this for credit, right? You're doing 50-19 for credit, you probably want to follow along like that. So a good research problem has certain key characteristics. It must be clear and concise. It must be researchable and feasible. It must be significant and relevant. And it must be ethical. Okay, so the idea here is when you are writing down your problem statement in the introduction section of the proposal, or in chapter 1, introduction, in the final manuscript, you need to write it down in such a way that that problem is clear and concise. It must be researchable and feasible. It must be significant and relevant, and it must be ethical, ideally. Okay? In terms of it being clear and concise here, what we're saying is that you must define this research problem in such a way that it's not ambiguous, right? And I think we'll look at examples here so that we understand what this is all about. But it must be clear and concise here. It should be represented in such a way that it's straightforward and easy to understand. And generally, the rule of thumb here is to try as much as possible to avoid using a lot of jargon and technical terms, unless if it's absolutely necessary, right? Must be straightforward and easy to understand. And the thing here is when the problem is clear and concise. Oh yeah. I was looking at the comment here. I thought I saw a message somewhere there, but I think it's an AI2 or something. Clarity and conciseness ensures that the problem is well understood by other researchers and the audience, right? And the thing here is that when you're conducting research, the proposal, and especially the final report, is going to be read by other people. In as much as you may be able to understand whatever it is you're going to write, even if it's not clear and concise, but other people that will be reading your final report, for instance, the proposal, will be unable to understand, right, what it is you're trying to put across here, right? So the goal here is you want to make sure that it's clear and concise, very clear and concise. What else? Well, we're saying here that a good research problem must be researchable and feasible. Now, there's something interesting here about this, right? You want to think about it from the perspective of the things that you need for you to conduct this research. An example here. I'll start with an example. I think we had earlier this year, I can't remember if that was a doctoral student or a master's student, who was proposing it's a doctoral student, I remember now, proposing something that, you know, is arguably fancy and is a reasonable problem, quite right? And the first question that I asked here, because I was there attending, was, do you think it's going to be feasible for you to collect data, right, for this study that you're proposing? Where do you work? Do you work at a bank or something? The answer was no. Okay. Well, I mean, I did make mention of the fact that if you've got into a stage where you're presenting this in the proposal, it's likely that you've started having conversations about this with your supervisor. If you've started having conversations about this with your supervisor, there's a possibility, and it happens a lot in academia, right, that your supervisor has collaborated, right, with people in the financial sector. If that's the case, then well and good. But if it's not, I wanted to remind this candidate, I wanted to remind her that there are certain sensitive areas in Zambia, right? Places where it is difficult for you to get data. And the financial sector is one of those areas. In fact, I gave an example to say we had somebody who conducted a very interesting study, right? A very interesting study, and some of you that are doing data science may want to look into this here. Derek Wally did some amazing work to do with. Oh my gosh, he's not here. He did some amazing work here. He was looking at fraud detection here using machine learning or something. But I guess I don't know if they've, because it was a long time ago though, fraud detection here. But usually, you know, this is where sometimes it's quite hard, right? To do some of these things. It's actually even easier to find information. On via the normal search engine and the application being used. It's sad like that. Dispatch.unza.zm. Fraud. I don't know. So anyway, the long and short of it, the reason I wanted to mention this is that wow, this is weird. Dispatch.unza.zm is not there. How is that even possible? Okay. Why can't I say it? I don't know why. This is very strange. What have they done here? Wow. I don't know what I did there, right? But anyway, so what I don't know if I'll be able to find what I'm looking for here, but he did some really interesting study here. It's unfortunate that they haven't yet uploaded. Maybe they haven't yet uploaded his dissertation here. But anyways, the thing with Derek Walia here is he works for Zanaco. He holds a very senior position there, and I believe it's part of the reason why he was able to easily gain access to the data. And in fact, when this question came up, he did highlight that because the data that he ultimately used here was not that adequate, and he cited the fact that it was difficult to gain access to the data as a problem. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that is a classic example of a research problem that is not feasible, is not researchable, because you'd have difficulty accessing data. And I know what you're thinking here. Well, we'll come up with synthetic data. I don't know, at PhD, maybe not. I don't know. Good luck convincing people like that, right? So I want to be very careful about these things here, right? Researchable and feasibility. So what we're saying here is that these research problems should be researchable, meaning that they should be investigated throughout the entire end-to-end process, right? Data collection all the way up to analysis and interpretation of the data. Okay, so you can look at this researchability and feasibility from the perspective of the resources available. Do you have the money to collect data? A nationwide study of health facilities in Zambia. Do you have the money to move around all the 10 corners of the country, right? Do you have the time? You know, are you going to have time to travel around? You go to Eastern Province, in Chinga, Western Province, and all those things, right? Yeah. Do you have the equipment to conduct a study? You know, I'm going to conduct this study where we're going to be using drones here to do surveys in national parks. Do you have the money to purchase, right? Drones, for instance. And more importantly, and I know for things like equipment, it may not necessarily be so much of an issue, but access to data is usually a trap that most of our students fall into, especially when you're working in sensitive areas. What are these sensitive areas? The financial sector, health, education. I have an example. I worked with a student, Dr. Kuyela, right? And he was interested in, when he was doing his master's, he was interested in he was interested in, graduated in 2022. He was interested in understanding he was interested in more tablet, right? So part of what he did when he carved out the research problem was, I want to collect data here from, so the more tablet is really targeted towards grade 1 to grade 7, by the way. I don't know if people know about the Mao tablet here. Mao tablet. If you're interested in educational data mining, I have ideas on what you can focus on, right? I remember this one time I actually even purchased, I actually have a copy of the Mao tablet, by the way. I even purchased the tablet because I was trying to understand this thing here. So the thing here is that the way he carved out his research was such that, no, I'm going to go to collect data from Chadley House School. Okay? Well, you better remind yourself that when you're collecting data from students, pupils in this particular case, you need to get consent, not just from, you can't get consent from the students, right? For you to collect data in a school, right? Let's say educate in a school, for instance, you need ethical clearance approval first from HSS REC or something. Anyway, UNZA REC, HSS REC, UNZA BREC, you know, NASREC, doesn't matter, we'll just call this NASREC because all of us are NASREC here. You get permission from NASREC. You get permission from the Ministry of Education. I'm co-supervising a student here who had to get permission from DEBS or something, from the school. When you get permission from the school, if you're collecting data from pupils, a pupil, when you're collecting data from somebody, a human being, you have got to get consent, right? That's an ethical thing to do. A person who is below the age of 18 cannot consent, cannot give you consent. So what you do, you get consent from their guardian, their legal guardian. So you notice here that you have to really be, you have to be to take into consideration all these issues that will potentially pose a challenge insofar as access to data is concerned. Certainly, there are certain places where people foolishly, and I'll use that word here, they'll still hold on to data, right? Well, in actual fact, that information is supposed to be out there in the general public, right? In the public domain, it's supposed to be there, but they'll make your life miserable like that. I had a very nasty experience with Zambia Statistical Agency. Yes, I'll put them out there. I don't know if there's someone here who works for Zambia Statistical Agency, but that was back in 2018. I think I was a year into my stay at UNZA, just gotten out of grad school, and I'd actually started a collaborative research project with colleagues, Griff Chelwa and I forget the name of this other person, is now professor something. But I remember we went to then Zamstad, right? I think on 3 separate occasions. And guess what? Some of the data were, it's quite sad really. Some of the information we're looking for were shape files, right? And there's nothing sensitive about those regional boundaries, nothing. You know, but the long and short of it here is if you're doing that as part of your PhD, that is time being wasted, right? You will spend months in some instances. In fact, you may spend the entire year chasing after data. So I want to be very careful here. Feasibility, right, is tied to a number of different aspects here, right? Is the problem researchable, right? Is this a sort of problem that will enable you to collect data and draw conclusions? You know, I'm interested in, I don't know here, understanding what sort of devices people use in nightclubs, right? And what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be conducting participant observations. I'll be going with my camera right there. Is that really feasible? No, right? So I want to be very careful here. Feasibility, very important. Ensuring that a problem is researchable, feasible, will prevent wasted effort. And, you know, it's quite sad. There are a number of our students here that will fall into this trap, right? Sometimes, I guess it's, I'll say maybe it's through ignorance or maybe trying to cut corners. You don't want to. I have a student here. I was sitting down with, I had a conversation with him not too long ago, right? Nothing too sensitive here. It's a learning process. He's looking for it. He's saying he needs a data set for him to work on his problem, right? He's working on road traffic controls. You know, so the idea behind road traffic controls is for you to build these computer vision models, you obviously need a significantly large data set, right? A labeled data set. Okay? Data set in this particular case of traffic signs, stop signs, right? What else? Images of road markings, right? Pedestrian walkways and all those things, solid lines and stuff. So we had a conversation. I'm telling him. And so he's telling me, no, what I've done so far is I went and I hope Henry is online here because I'm using him as an example here. People should learn here. I went and I've been taking images, right? But how is that feasible? How is that realistically feasible? If you're going out there and you're taking images of what, right? So it's talking about images of these road signs, right? Road signs. By the way, here's the thing here. If you go to the highway code, I guess we had a discussion about this. I was telling you about the highway code, right? So he's going out there. He's looking for this sort of data set. I'm telling him, how long is it going to take you for you to how long is it going to take for you to get these images? Because you don't have a labeled data set, right? You want to manually get you want to get these images, and then after you get these images, you're going to have to label them, right? So the first question I asked him was, how many, I think markings somewhere at the bottom, right, road signs, how many road signs do we have in Zambia, right? And how many images are you going to take here? I mean, I did tell him that I have tons and tons of footage. You know, my dash cam here has been collecting images of roads in Zambia, so signs are there and all that, but I guess I was manually doing this, right? So I'm saying, how many of these road signs do you have? There are a lot of them, right? That's one thing. Well, if there are a lot of them, right? Don't you think that what would be wise for you is go out there? Well, yes, we know Zambia uses the SADC standard here, right? When it comes to markings and road signs. And this is a conversation we had early on in the process. So you can't say I'm going to go to Kergo and get a data set that is from the United States or something, right? Because the signs there are completely different from our signs, right? You know, left hand side when driving, this is right hand side and all those things, and signs are different actually. But the thing is, if you just spend time, right, and you do a comprehensive literature review, you will find labeled data sets, right? Wasted effort. If there's no labeled data set here, you begin to notice that the approach that you're taking will probably result in wasted effort, right? So you spend months doing something that perhaps ultimately you realize is not going to be feasible or something. But what we're saying really is that I want to make sure that this problem is researchable and feasible. And this is the reason why sometimes you may think when you're presenting that, you may think that maybe the people that the people that are giving you feedback just don't want you to do that project, right? Well, no, they don't want you to fail, right? Because it turns out that the vast majority of us have done this over and over again, have worked with students over and over again. And like in my case, I mean, I started supervising students, honors level students, when I was doing my master's, right? So back in 2020, I started my master's in 2011. I started supervising students in 2012 or something. But so over the years here, when somebody just stands in front and they're doing a presentation, it's easy for me to spot out these issues, right? And sometimes people won't listen, they'll proceed. And somewhere down the line, they'll change course. They would have wasted maybe a year or months, right? Anyway, so I want to ensure that the problem is researchable to prevent wasted effort on issues that cannot be practically addressed, right? And it also allows for the successful completion of the study, right? So I want to think about this feasibility here from the perspective of resource availability, money, time, equipment, access to data, especially if you are a PhD student, because the expectation is that the stuff you're doing is expected to be to have significantly more depth than somebody who's doing a master's. So there's always this temptation. I'm going to conduct a longitudinal study. Do you even know what that means here? But that's okay. Okay, so what else? We're saying here that the research problem ought to be significant and relevant. And this is pretty self-explanatory here, right? We want to make sure that the problem addresses an important issue that contributes to the field of study. Now, so this is interesting here, right? Significance can be looked at from a number of different angles here. It can be relative to the body of knowledge. I'll give myself as an example. Wikipedia, right? Now, please, I mean, I'm sure some of you, I can scratch around here and I can say, you know, doing research on Wikipedia, content contribution here is a good thing here. But guess what? I don't think it does a lot here by way of contributing to these pressing societal issues in Zambia, is it? I mean, I can probably, you know, sit down and I can write down something convincing as to why this is important here. But from the perspective of Zambia, especially as it relates to things like, and by the way, this is somewhere else where you can find problems if you're looking for problems, right? If you look at Vision 2030 and you look at this Wikipedia thing project we're waiting on, I would argue like, but wait a minute. If you look at the strategic objectives in the, but where is it now? If you look at the strategic objectives in the Vision 2030 here, this is it here, means of finance here. Which strategic objective, which of these important aspects that are outlined in this document, I don't know why this is, I have to download this, I guess, are really linked to that problem, right? Well, I would say no, right? No doesn't necessarily mean that this is not significant, right? It's significant in the sense that it contributes to the existing body of knowledge. So when we're talking about significance and relevance, you're not just looking at to what extent is the results that are going to come out of your research going to influence policy direction in the world or in Zambia or something. How is your research going to make people's lives better and all those things? No, right? The goal here is we must look, this is what I was talking about here. This is an interesting document, by the way, and it's still valid. It's still about 4 years before we realize these things. I've certainly found a number of interesting problems here by looking at this document. I do encourage you colleagues to find time and it's a short document, 42 pages on just 42 pages. And you don't need to read the entire 42 pages. You just need to go to, there's this, there are these annexes here. So I want to look into the sector visions and target goals, especially the sector vision and target goals would be the. So if you look at our Wikipedia thing here, it doesn't, one would argue that it doesn't really align to either of these, like if you look at the sectors, I don't know if there's a sector it aligns to here, either the visions or the targets, right? So from the perspective of Zambia here, it's like, it does very little, really, I guess. I know it's a weird example here, but the point I'm trying to put across though is that the problem is still relevant because it contributes, right, to academic discourse. We are contributing to the existing body of knowledge insofar as academia is concerned, right? So we should look at relevance and significance from the perspective of academia, society, right, and the scientific context, ideally. Okay, the goal here is when your research problem is significant and relevant, you'll be able to explicitly state the research contributions, right, to the existing body of knowledge. You'll be able to clearly state or identify pressing questions or problems that are being addressed from a perspective of a community or something, right? And what sort of impact, in essence, the impact that your research is going to have. Anyways, so significance and relevance, we can't run away from this. If you are putting together a proposal document, a reminder, there's supposed to be a dedicated, I'm going to go back here to remind us. There's supposed to be a dedicated section, and there we go. In your proposal document, yeah, this is a proposal document structure here, right? You're supposed to have your context, so your come on, yellow, background, statement of the problem, the purpose, objectives, research questions, right? And then you are also supposed to have this. It must be there. Whether you're doing PhD or master's, it must be there. There's some things that are just supposed to appear in a thesis manuscript that is being done by somebody doing a PhD or a master's by research. But what else? Well, we see here that the other characteristic, the last characteristic here, is to do with the fact that a good research problem must be ethical. It's a good thing we had a very in-depth discussion regarding ethical considerations in research, right? So the idea here is we want to make sure that, or a good research problem must be carved out in such a way that it can be studied ethically. If you carve out a problem where you are going to send an email or you call your friend, can you send me CDR records so that I finish my master's? That is unethical, right? That is a horrible research problem. You know, most of us here, we know this, right? Most of us have connections. We've reached a stage where you've built these links, right? And it's very easy for you to gain access to information unethically, right? But what we're saying is that if you carve out a problem like that, it's a bad research problem. It's not a good research problem, right? So you should carve it out in such a way that it can be studied ethically. And you're taking into account all those different ethical considerations we discussed, right? So for instance, a good research problem will ensure that it respects the rights and well-being of participants. Before participants participate in your study, you provide them with an information sheet. You provide them with a consent form so that they sign and explicitly indicate that they were not coerced, right? They are willingly participating in your study. We don't want to carve out problems that are similar to the Tuskegee, the infamous Tuskegee experiment, or the infamous Stanford prison experiment, right? What else, right? We want to make sure that when we're coming up with a good research problem, we are doing this by way of ensuring that we obtain necessary approvals, right? So a good research problem will be carved out in such a way that you will be able to get ethical clearance approval from all the necessary entities. If you are working on a problem in education and you need to go in schools, right, or Ministry of Education offices or something, or even distribute a questionnaire to people, teachers and all those things, you need permission from NASREC, from the Ministry of Education. If you're going to develop some fancy software that is going to be used by grade 1 pupils or something, whatever, or people that are in reception, right, a tablet application, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to get permission from NASREC, from the ministry, from the school, and then you get consent from the guardians as well. If you are conducting a study in that is health-centric, I'm co-supervising a doctoral student who is working towards coming up with a framework here, right, to do with data ideally, right, digitized data. And we had a very lengthy discussion, I remember, where we were reminding him that you need to get permission from NASREC, from NASREC, NASREC, from Zabrek, but NASREC, from NHRA, right, National Health Research Authority, from the Ministry of Health, right? You then get permission from the individual health facilities where you're going to, or maybe you can use the umbrella Ministry of Health here, right? Unless if you're going to be collecting data from private health facilities. And so these are things to think about here, right? It must be, a good research problem must be conducted ethically. Now, ethical consideration, I know we are regurgitating this, we already had a discussion here, fosters public trust in the research you're conducting. It also explicitly or implicitly protects all your study participants and ensures that the research adheres to legislation that currently exists or regulations. Okay? If that makes sense here. Now, I know at the time uses 2010, and we said that here. I want to suggest that when we meet on Thursday, we're going to continue with this. When we meet on Thursday, we're going to be looking at how exactly we write a problem statement, right? So we know the characteristics of a good research problem. The next step is how do we write it down? It may sound trivial here, especially if you've already started reading here, but it turns out that you want to be deliberate in the way that you are phrasing or how you are writing things, right? Nothing to it really. You begin to realize why, when we go through this 7-step process of framing a problem, you begin to you appreciate the reason why a document like this, if you look at how it was written, it's organized in the way that it is, right? Where you have background, where you have the actual problem statement, where you have the aim or the goals, specific objectives, right? Significance, right? So I want to appreciate all of these things. Anyways, I'm going to pause here. I know this is 2011, but just going to pause here and ask if there are thoughts or questions about this. If not, I will share this thing as soon as I can. And then, I hope I'm taking myself. I don't think then we can take it up from there. I don't know if there are any thoughts about this, colleagues. Please, if you haven't started doing this already, it is important that when we start looking at how we write, a problem statement, if you have a topic, it becomes a lot easier for you to write, right? And in fact, if you've already identified a topic, you'll be able to ask relevant questions as we are having these discussions. So I want to encourage us to, if we haven't done this already, between now and Thursday, identify a topic. I know if you're a doctoral student, you already have a topic or a concept, so we can use that as a starting point or something. All right, thank you very much then. I see there are no questions. I'll see you when you see me. We were supposed to have 2 makeups because we didn't have that. So I'm suggesting that once we have our class on Thursday, we can agree when on Saturday, on Sunday, we can have another session that we make up. I'm very keen to get us to a stage where at least we start writing down that proposal, because it's one of those major assessments. But also, I'm not doing this alone. There are other people that are supposed to step in and I guess talk about their parts of the course itself. So I don't want to eat into their time here. Thank you very much, everybody. And
sorry, Doc, before you leave, I have a question.
Yes, yes, please.
It's not regarding to the course, just the program in general. Soon as how we're about to start a new week, has there been any feedback regarding the other courses which classes have not yet begun?
Yeah, so we're discussing that. We have literally a meeting tomorrow at 10, a postgraduate committee meeting. So I will have feedback on that tomorrow. I took note of the emails and the messages that were sent through by respective representatives. So just give me until end of day tomorrow and I'll be able to get back to you. And just to mention,
right,
maybe an update in terms of, I don't know about exams for term 1, but apparently the major works have been concluded on campus. And I was there last week at some point here, and I don't know about that here, but we have been told that we need to start what do you call this? We need to return to campus because there was no water, and so we were told to work remotely. So there's a bit of progress. I guess it's me saying, just in case they come up with a timetable about the exams, something you want to, start preparing yourself psychologically, I guess, if that makes sense. Yeah. Any other thoughts about this? All right. Okay. With that being said, thank you very much, everybody, and happy Sunday, whatever is remaining out of your Sunday. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you.